So go to chapter 22 in economics A level, the effects of globalization. For globalization, it simply means interconnectedness between different economies, making the world become a small market. That's globalization. And when we talk about the effects of globalization, we're simply talking about the impacts of globalization, either positively or negatively. So we're going to start with the possible benefits of globalization. The first one here is increased economic growth. And when we talk about economic growth, we're simply talking about both the potential and the actual growth. And at the end of it all, what has globalization done to growth? This simply means that output would have increased. So no matter what we need to talk about here, we're still going to talk about how export has increased over time, how output has increased over time through productivity. So let's read further anyway. The possible benefits of globalization: increased economic growth. Globalization can increase both actual growth and potential growth for an economy. Research suggests there is a link between greater trade openness and higher income per capita. So we're simply talking about an open economy here. So with an open economy, there's likelihood that an open economy will witness high income per capita. That's the point they are making here. Now, they say some economies will particularly benefit from globalization since their growth is driven by exports. So since one of the factors of globalization, or one of the reasons for globalization, is exportation, it simply means that some countries would benefit from globalization because their growth is mostly from exports. They do more of exports. And because they do more of exports, it increases their productivity and it increases their growth. Then they said China, for example, has used export-led growth as its main economic strategy over recent decades. In 1970, China exports, are you here with me, please? China's export of goods and services accounted for just 2.5% of GDP. In 2006, this peaked at 37.2%. In comparison, export as a percentage of GDP peaked for the US at only 13.6% in 2014. So globalization, by opening up trade, has clearly helped China to achieve rapid economic growth in recent decades. So with open trade, which is international trade, they are comparing China and USA here, which simply means that between 1970 to 2014, China has witnessed more rapid growth compared to US based on open economy and trade, international trade. And it's simply because China do more of exportation. That's about that. Then globalization will also help to increase potential growth through the impact of trade on productivity. So if productivity is increasing, it simply means that output per worker is increasing over time. And that would have also bring about increasing globalization. Globalization creates more competition between firms across the world. With productivity, if productivity is increasing, it also means that output per worker is increasing, and that would also lead to increase in GDP. That's about that, which is also about growth. Creating competition by firms. They said globalization creates more competition between firms across the world. In highly competitive global market, firms are under more pressure to keep costs down so they can remain price competitive. This forces firms to maximize efficiency. This leads to higher productivity in the economy and therefore higher potential growth. So there's increasing potential growth here because globalization has brought about global firms competing with each other. And for you to remain internationally competitive as a firm, it means you have to find a way to reduce your cost. So most of the firms that do either export or import are now thinking about how to remain competitive. And the only way to remain competitive is to find a way to reduce their cost. And that has allowed them to be more efficient. With efficiency, then they are able to reduce their cost and they remain competitive. And that has also bring about increase in productivity, which is leading to an increase in economic growth. This leads, then the short run and long run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right, causing a rise in a real GDP. Because there's increase in productivity, there's increase in the GDP. It simply means that both the long run and the short run aggregate supply would shift to the right because both of them represent increase in productivity, either in the long run or the short run. Then we have, less productive firms are likely to contract or shut down. Trade openness means productive firms have a large market to sell to, so they are likely to expand. So now, for firms that are less competitive, that continue to, incur more costs compared to their rivals, they won't have any other choice than to shut down or reduce their operations. Resources will be reallocated. Okay, so they are likely to expand. Okay, trade openness means productive firms have a large market to sell. Because there is international trade, it simply means that firms, whichever country you are locally, you have access to sell to customers cut across the world, and that will bring about your expansion. That is the point I'm making there. Resources will be reallocated towards those firms or sectors where productivity is higher, and resources will be channeled. You're not just going to waste resources here because resources are even scarce. So there's not going to be any reason to waste resources because we are going to only produce through firms that are more efficient, which means resources will be channeled to firms that are productive efficient. Competition also promotes dynamic efficiency, which simply means that firms will be able to use technology as much as possible. Firms will have the incentive to invest in innovation, both product and process innovation, to make competitive and to fully benefit from the ability to sell to a larger market. Process innovation means firms will be more efficient in their methods of production, which will increase productivity. Since production is increasing, since we are having to sell with increasing competition and we have the opportunity to access the global market, it simply means that firms have the incentive to be dynamic efficient. And being dynamic efficient means you'll be able to invest as a firm on innovation technology, and that would also increase productivity. So, okay, let's see here. They said, okay, the creation of new product, that's innovation, will encourage firms to invest in new technology. Product innovation may increase productivity if new capital is required to create a new product. So we're still simply talking about how there's increasing growth. There's also increasing growth because there's dynamic efficiency, which comes through product innovation. So product innovation will also increase productivity. And anytime that productivity is increasing, it will simply bring about increasing in growth. Then another reason why growth can also increase is through migration. They said increasing migration is also a characteristic of globalization. Immigration can increase economic growth by filling skills gap in the economy and so raising the productivity of existing workers. Immigrants may set up their own businesses, and if successful, will create jobs in the economy as their business expand. Immigration usually increase the working age population, increasing output. All these factors increase economic growth. Another factor that increases economic growth is immigration. Now, when we talk about immigration, we're simply talking about the movement of people into the country. If immigrants are coming into a country, they are coming in as probably economic immigrants, and which simply means they might be able to, cover up the gap that is missing in the domestic economy by offering their skills, their expertise, where it is missing within the economy. And as soon as that is done, it increases productivity for that country. And because productivity is increasing, growth will also rise. Also, immigrants might as well come into a country to set up their own business. And if their business succeeds, it simply means they'll be employing more workers domestically, and that would also bring about increase in productivity, which will lead to economic growth. I think the point is clear there. So not all countries or regions within countries will benefit. Although some firms may be more productive, others may be forced to close, which will generate unemployment. So if workers are occupationally or geographically immobile, actual growth in a region or a country could fall. It will depend on the extent to which some firms or sectors shut down and the mobility of resources between users. Workers who travel overseas to work might negatively affect economic growth, particularly if skilled workers leave an economy. So not all economies will enjoy globalization because some firms, based on the fact that they are inefficient, we don't have any other choice than to leave the market. So because they are leaving the market, it means workers will be forced to become unemployed. And most of the time, this really occurs if workers are geographical or occupationally immobile. They don't have the flexibility to switch job, or they don't have the flexibility to move from where there's no job opportunity to where there is job opportunity. And if this happens, it falls down economic growth. So we won't just talk about economic growth because there's globalization. Sometimes we might also fall a victim because we are not doing well as a firm, or some workers lack the flexibility to move between jobs or to move from one region to another. So because they are unable to move from one region to another, those regions that need them will not be able to have them, and those regions will suffer from economic growth. Do you get it? And because there's globalization, some workers will have the opportunity, some locals will have the opportunity to move from their own country outside. So there could be immigration. And if there's immigration, it affects the supply of labor in that country too, which simply means that productivity might as well fall in that country, which means we might not be witnessing increase in growth. So there's increase in economic growth if immigration brings about filling the gap between what is missing in the labor market. Or probably immigrants are, start setting up their work or setting up businesses that succeed, or probably firms in that market are efficient because they are productive efficient and they are dynamic efficient. So all these will bring about increase in economic growth. Any question about economic growth?
No.
Okay. So go to increase in tax revenue. So another positive impact of globalization on the economy is increase in tax revenue. And when we talk about tax revenue, we're simply talking about the tax, which is simply a levy imposed by governments on production of goods and services or for consumption of goods and services. That's tax. And with globalization, countries would witness importation. And through importation, they might be able to make taxes on importation, which is tariffs. So let me read further anyway. If globalization increases economic growth for an economy, then tax revenue should rise. If national income rises, then incomes and spending will be higher in the economy. Firms also have potential to make higher profits. So if globalization has increased economic growth, it simply means that tax revenue should rise. And why would tax revenue rise? Tax revenue will rise because countries will be able to do importation because there's increase in growth. And if national income rises too, if income level increases within the economy, people will spend more. And what part of those things they're going to spend on is importation. So spend on importation means they have to pay taxes on importation. And firms also have the potential to make higher profit, especially importing firms. So this means income tax revenue from goods and services, for VAT, and revenue from corporate taxes should rise. So when you look at it this way, with globalization, there's economic growth that is increasing, which means people will have more income based on the fact that there's employment opportunity. Goods are produced, income level has increased. So firms will be making more money based on the fact that income level has risen. Consumers will be buying more goods. That means firms will be selling more than what they used to sell. That increases their revenue and as well increase their profits. So firms will have to pay taxes on profits, which is corporation tax. That's the first, and that increases government revenue through taxes. Income level is increasing. Consumers would also spend on importation. And because they are spending on importation, the government would charge taxes on importation, which is tariffs. And through tariffs, government revenue would also increase. That's another one, another way which government revenue is increasing through taxation. The third one is consumption. Individuals' income are increasing. That means purchasing power is increasing within the economy. And because purchasing power is increasing for firms or for individuals, they'll be able to spend more, which means value-added tax would also be paid. So government will be making more tax on income, on profits, on consumption, and that increases government revenue through increased tax revenue. So they said some countries also impose taxes on imports, which I talked about anyway. In this case, an increase in imports for goods and services as a proportion of GDP will raise tariff revenue for governments. FDI inflows will also create tax revenue for the recipient country. For example, a transnational moving a car plant from the UK to China would raise tax revenue for the Chinese economy. However, tax revenue as a percentage of GDP is a lot lower in developing countries than in developed ones. In developing countries, it is generally between 10 to 15%, whereas for developed economies, it's average about 35%. Developing countries therefore need to broaden their tax base if economic growth is to generate higher tax revenues. Improving the efficiency of tax collection in developing countries would also generate high returns in tax revenue from economic growth. So, yes, tax revenue could increase through globalization, but
it has a cost.
And mostly the cost here is based on the fact that it's mostly dwelling on developing countries, because developing countries lack the computation on how to put about tax or how to monitor taxes. And mostly because developing countries want to attract multinationals, their taxes are in between 10 to 15%, unlike developed countries or developed economies where you have to pay, which is large. Maybe you have to pay even more than 30% on taxes. So that is the point
So
there.
what would you say is a relative, is a good number for tax revenue on income?
On income.
Yeah, from an economic perspective, and why?
Well, on an economic point of view, income on tax should be within 15 to 20%. And why? And this should be charged. There's what we call pay as you earn, payee. So if taxes are charged progressively, it makes sense because it takes the burden away from low income earners to high income earners. So charging a tax proportionally, to me, I would not put a percentage. I
Yeah,
would rather,
that was my follow-up question. Do you
yeah,
think the more you earn, the more you should be taxed?
yes, because it reduces the gap between the rich and the poor. But it has a consequence also. The consequence is
That the rich would think about living in the country.
leaving the country.
But then you can do an exit tax.
Yeah, but if the poor start thinking, or if the rich start thinking about leaving the country, government can also come up with tax relief. Do you get it? But all in all, taxes are needed. They are inevitable because it brings about economic growth. You understand? But it is for the government of the day to tell us its objective and what the aim of taxation is about. So it's not something that you and I can sit down and really discuss. It's something that deals with the objective of the economy, which is macroeconomic objective, and what the government wants to achieve when it comes to those fiscal policy.
So there's a lot of countries that don't even have tax on income, like for example, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates.
Yeah, because they have other sources of revenue, like oil. They have other sources of revenue, but countries that do not have, we are simply talking about countries that might want to rely heavily on taxes. They don't have natural resources. So the only source of revenue could be through taxation. And for them to really make a lot from taxes, they have to broaden their tax base by monitoring out the collection of taxes. So, well, all in all, we just have to put in mind that when it comes to taxes, they have to be paid, but whatever government needs to do with them, it's more important than the taxes that are being paid. Because government will be judged based on how taxpayer money is being spent. Does it make sense? Okay. So for increased tax revenue, I think we are clear about it. So firms will pay taxes, which is from the profit they make, corporation taxes. Individuals will spend on importation. Government will be able to make revenues through tariffs. That increases government revenue too. Consumers will also purchase domestic goods. That means VAT will be paid. I think that point is clear. FDIs will set up in the country, they also pay taxes. But the setback about taxes is that for developing countries, they might not as well generate more revenue through taxation because their taxes are always low and they don't even have efficiency when it comes to tax collection. And it simply means they might not as well, grow if they rely mostly on taxation. So the third benefit of economy, or the third benefit of globalization is economies of scale. And when we talk about economies of scale, we're simply talking about a cost advantage based on expansion. The fact that there's globalization, it simply means businesses will be able to operate and sell on a larger scale. And that allows them to exploit economies of scale. So I'm going to read further though. Globalization, by creating a large international market for a firm to target, allows firms to gain from economies of scale. They can increase their scale of production to minimize their average cost. This will be beneficial for both producers and consumers. Now, because there's globalization, which increases our accessibility to the global market, it simply means we can increase our scale of production. And by increasing our scale of production, both consumers and producers will be better off. Now we start with producers. Producers can make higher profits or they can lower their prices to remain price competitive. That's for producers. Because they have the opportunity to operate on a larger scale. They can make higher profit or at the same time reduce their price because their average cost of production is reducing, and that would allow them to remain competitive. For consumers, prices are likely to be lower if a firm is benefiting from economies of scale. So for consumers, they'll be able to buy goods at affordable prices because the firms that they are buying from are witnessing reduction in their average cost of production. Signs of economies of scale are both internal and external. For example, a firm selling to a large market can negotiate bulk buying discounts on raw materials. So it could be internal or external, but the point is, either ways, we would be able to witness economies of scale based on the fact that we are expanding. So, example here is internal economies of scale, which means a firm can experience purchasing economies of scale, which is the same as bulk purchase, by by having a discount, reduction in the price based on the fact that it's buying large quantity, which is discounts. External economies of scale arise when the size of a particular industry and economy increases. Individual firms might benefit from this. And there's external economies of scale if individual firms are benefiting based on the fact that the industry is expanding as a whole. And that is also part of economies of scale. So either internal or external, with globalization, there's possibility for firms to exploit economies of scale or to gain from economies of scale. And that could increase their profits or make them to remain internationally competitive by selling at a lower price. Do you get that?
Mm.
And for external economies of scale, they are talking about increased availability of suitable skilled labor. Because the industry is growing, it will attract skilled workers within that area of industry. And that makes the supply of labor increases more than the demand for labor. And that reduces the wage rate, which is external economies of scale. Do you get that? Do you get it, please? The fourth one, lower prices and higher consumer surplus. With globalization led to a fall in the price of some goods and services as production is switched from higher cost location to low cost location. Cost of production could also fall if firms are able to move from one location that has the tendency of incurring more cost for them to a location that reduces their cost of production. Do you get it?
Mm-hmm.
So being able to do that is because there's globalization. Because globalization means interconnectedness. Without globalization, we might not even have what we call transnational or multinational companies. So multinational companies can think about moving their factory to China, where there's large population or low cost of labor, or Africa for their production if it is cheaper compared to where they are. So for example, switching production on television sets from the US to China will lead to a fall in the labor cost because Chinese workers are prepared to work for much lower wages than US workers. That is the point I just made. Equally, the globalization of technology means that a Chinese factory can use the most advanced machines and methods of production to ensure the lowest cost. Globalization, even through capital intensive method of production. Globalization allows firms to source products from a wider variety of countries and firms. The wider the supplier network, the lower the price at which a firm can buy is likely to be. Key to lower costs is the ability to use lower paid workers, often in the developing world. With globalization, firms can source for raw materials cut across the world from cheaper suppliers. And because they are able to source raw materials or components from cheap suppliers, it simply means that they'll be able to sell at a reduced price. And with globalization, it means firms have access to large numbers of suppliers. And the more the suppliers, the lesser you pay on supplies. Do you understand? Because it becomes excess. So that reduces price for consumers. That reduces price for consumers, which will in turn increase their consumer surplus. Globalization via lower tariffs on imported finished goods can also contribute to lower prices for consumers. Prices are also likely to fall as a result of globalization due to productivity gains by firms. With globalization, remember, we won't talk about globalization without free trade. And with free trade, it simply means we are cutting down all restrictions that would hinder trade relationship. And that means tariffs are likely to fall. And because tariffs are falling, it means the price of imported goods would fall, which increases the consumption of imported goods. You get it? As prices would fall.
Mm.
And for firms also, they said prices are also likely to fall as a result of globalization due to productivity gains by firms. Firms might also be able to source for imported raw materials at a reduced price because there's globalization. This becomes increasingly important as a means of maintaining global price competitiveness. Firms need to be productively efficient to survive in markets which are more intensely competitive as a result of globalization. A rise in productivity reduces average cost, and these are likely to be passed on to consumers. So, due to globalization, firms are faced with global or international rivals, which simply means that firms will be forced to be productive efficient. If they are not productive efficient, they won't be able to, to compete with the rest, and they won't be able to stay in that global market. So that means they have to maintain almost the same global price. Do you understand the point there? So, and that would even mean that they have to increase their productivity. So globalization will force firms to be more productive efficient, because productive efficiency means you are producing at the lowest possible cost in that market. And because the market is global, whatever products you produce in Libya will be produced elsewhere too. So customers have access to buy from the lowest priced exporters. So it simply means for you to be part of them, you have to find a way to be productive efficient. Lower prices will increase consumer surplus, so consumers will experience a welfare gain. A recent report by IMF suggests that lower income households particularly benefit from lower prices due to trade. This is because they spend a high proportion of their income on tradable goods, such as food and drinks, than those on higher incomes. Higher income groups spend a high proportion of their income on less tradable sectors, such as services. So the point here is, if firms are able to sell at a lower price, they'll be able to sell to low income earners, because low income earners buy most of the tradable goods. High income earners, they spend mostly on services. So for firms or for businesses that rely on production of goods and services, they have to be efficient for them to remain competitive. Those that are competitive, those that are able to sell at a lower price, will gain more customers than those that are unable to, that are not efficient. So because they are able to sell at a lower price, that increases consumer surplus, and there's a welfare gain for them. Globalization is, however, leading to a rise in the price of some goods and services because it is raising average world incomes. Higher income means higher demand for individual products, where supply is not perfectly elastic in the long run. This puts upward pressure on prices. But with globalization and a rise in income level, demand is expected to increase more than supply. And because demand is increasing more than supply, people have faith there is a pressure on prices, which means demand pull inflation. Are you with me? Which means demand pull inflation. And that might result into higher prices for consumers. So during the first decade, okay, so that's the point about it. So the point is, globalization, yes, brings about low prices, but at the same time, it puts pressure on prices, because with globalization, income level rises mostly. And because income level is increasing, individuals have more money to buy. But what are they buying? They are buying goods that are already scarce. So that's why they said here that supply might be perfectly elastic. If supply is perfectly elastic, then it simply means we might not be able to buy as at when due. And that means there's scarcity, shortages, which increases prices over time. Do you get it?
Mhm.
Any question about that?
No.
Okay. So the next impact of globalization is more choices.
Obviously.
Yeah, because globalization means import and export. It means open economy.
Yes.
And when there's open economy, it means consumers have access
Companies
to
are more
variety.
interlinked.
Yes. So people have access to varieties of goods. So the availability of goods and services has considerably increased with globalization. So there's more consumer choice. The number of different products available in high streets, shopping centers, and supermarkets is larger than it was 20 years ago. It's the same in the service market. For example, in many countries, people choose to go abroad on holiday. Some argue that goods and services have become more homogenized, similar, because of globalization. A holiday in Spain is the same as a holiday in Peru, apart from the scenery. The food is international food. So it means you could as well eat a Chinese food here in Libya. So the hotels provide the same rooms and facilities, and sightseeing is packaged to suit Western taste. So which simply means we can as well have a scene like the Maldives here in Libya. Do you get it? It's possible. It's globalization. We can as well find it. It's an island. We could find an island in between here.
Yeah.
We have artificial beach around. So what can't we do? It's about you figuring out what is out there and making it available here.
Yeah, a good example of this is in China, they have a fake Paris town.
So it's just about without globalization, they might not be able to get those resources or materials needed to fit in their objective. But globalization has made it accessible. Do you get it? Do you get it?
Mhm.
So equally, a particular skirt made in China may end up being bought by a girl in the UK, the USA, or Japan. So globalization allows, it's an open economy, it's free trade. So whatever is being produced in China, we can as well get it here. Whatever services is rendered in China, we can as well get it in Nigeria. It's globalization, and that increases choices for consumers. I think the point is clear.
Yes.
Higher living standards. Real GDP per capita is used to measure living standards. If globalization promotes a rise in real GDP per capita, then living standards on average will rise in an economy. Globalization has raised income around the world. Consumers are therefore able to buy more goods. However, not every consumer has gained. Globalization, we talked about when we were talking about increased consumption with globalization, there's a problem. Income level has risen over time, but which simply means globalization has increased the income level of individuals. And because the income level of individuals has increased, the quality of life they live will also improve. And that improves, that brings about a higher living standard. But the point is that not every individual gained from globalization. They said, however, not every consumer has gained. Workers in the US who have lost their jobs because production has moved to China are likely to be worse off. Equally, some argue that globalization is a cause of below average earnings for workers in countries like the US. So, because there's globalization, some individuals are worse off because of structural unemployment. Do you get it?
Yes.
So that is about structural
Wait,
unemployment.
can you repeat?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, they say, I'm going to read, then explain. They said, however, not every consumer has gained. Workers in the US who have lost their jobs because production has moved to China are likely to be worse off. Why are they worse off? They are worse off because there's structural unemployment. Certain sector in America has now been moved to China because it is cheaper producing in China than producing in the USA. So those workers that are working in those sectors in America would have lost their jobs. Because they are losing their jobs means they will be worse off. And what has brought about this globalization? And in China, they will be able to witness higher quality of life because they are able to gain jobs due to structural employment.
Mhm.
Do you understand the point they make there now? Is it clear now, please, or not?
Yes.
Okay. And also, many developing countries have benefited from globalization through inward investment, which is FDI. Globalization is inevitably leading to a shift of production from the developed world to the developing world because the developing world is now witnessing industrialization. This is one key way in which the poor developing countries of the world can increase their living standards. So globalization has shifted production to the developing economies. And as a result of that, the developing economies are now the ones witnessing industrialization. I'll be right back. So we go to the possible cost of globalization. The first one, displaced workers. When we talk about displaced workers, we're simply talking about workers losing their jobs. There was I think a meme recently. I saw it on maybe TikTok. It's an American guy. They were maybe UK, I don't know, maybe a British guy. They were asking. They said, "What has happened to?" He said, "The immigrants have taken all their jobs," and they asked him, "What's his qualification?" He said, "They are even taking the qualifications or something like that." It was a meme, I believe. So the point is, Globalization means I could be educated in Nigeria and as well work in Libya, which simply means I can compete with a Libyan for a position in terms of job opportunity. And if I am better than the Libyan, I might be getting the job. Same goes to a Libyan going to Nigeria to get a job. If he's better than the Nigerian there, he gets the job or she gets the job. So let's read further anyway. It's the first cause of globalization, displaced workers. The transfer of much of manufacturing from Western Europe and the US to countries such as China has led to large-scale losses of jobs in the developed world. At the same time, jobs have been created in developing world. In Western Europe and the USA, many workers who become unemployed have found new jobs, particularly in the service sector. Because in America, well, this Western world, they are witnessing what we call deindustrialization, while developing countries are witnessing industrialization. So those that are employed in the manufacturing sector in Western world are losing their jobs. But they are with occupational mobility and geographical mobility, they are able to get jobs in the service sector. Are you with me, please?
Yes.
But okay. But now, as before, okay, they said, but not necessarily at the same rate of pay as before. Some have simply remained unemployed. Structural unemployment in traditional manufacturing areas has therefore occurred. Those changes, however, are not new. Throughout the 1800s, excuse me, hold on. So, people start losing their job. But this is not new because it has been happening since the 1800s too. In the UK, there was a large transfer of workers from rural areas and towns and from agriculture to manufacturing and services. Globalization might be speeding up the rate of change, but there would have been change anyway. It's difficult to identify the impact of globalization, the impact globalization has had on job losses compared to what would have happened anyway as technology advanced. So the point is, yeah, there's always going to be globalization and there's always going to be change. We leave it or take it, there's always going to be change. So the impacts globalization has had on job losses is not something we can really understand because it depends on voluntary, it depends on different factors. Some people do not even want to work. There's voluntary unemployment. Some people don't have the flexibility to work. So it's not like globalization has brought that. It is you bringing upon yourself, not wanting to be flexible through training or education. So you wouldn't blame globalization on that, for that, sorry.
Yeah.
Do you get it? So migration also creates some displacement of workers. Immigrants compete in the job market with workers from their host country. Native workers can then perceive immigrants as taking their jobs or lowering wage rates because of competition in the labor market. So look at the situation here. What the native workers might think, oh, they're not getting job because immigrants are, taking up their jobs. Or probably the supply of labor is increasing. And as a result of that, the wage rate is falling. So because immigrants are economic immigrants, they don't want to come here to just sit down idle. So they might as well take up any jobs, even low-paying job, to survive. And this simply means the supply of labor might as well increase. And that will pull down the wage rate in the labor market. So the exact impact of immigration on displacement of native workers and wage rate is likely to vary from country to country. So the impact depends on the country also and the kind of gap in the labor market. Any question about that?
Yeah.
So that's the first negative impact of globalization, displaced workers. Then the next one is exploitation of workers. Exploitation of workers is when an employer treats its workers unfairly. Exploitation usually arises when there is an unbalanced power relationship between an employer and employee. So there's exploitation if you are not treating your workers fairly. This is particularly the case for unskilled labor because there is a large supply of it. In advanced economies, low-skilled workers are effectively having to compete with workers in developing countries. If their wages are too high, then firms can choose to import components from abroad rather than make them domestically or move production overseas. So unskilled workers, the number of unskilled workers are always higher than skilled workers, which means the supply of unskilled workers are always higher. And that gives firms the opportunity to exploit them. So if you're not taking the job, other unskilled workers will take the job because there are pool of them in the market.
Yeah. What do you think would happen if there were to be more skilled workers than unskilled workers?
It will never happen.
What if it happens?
It won't. You know why?
Why?
Because one of the reasons why we won't have such situation is because the world is the world is structured in a way that there's class. So when some certain people move from the class ladder, so you moving from one class ladder to another means certain individuals have left that class ladder to another ladder. So there's no space until certain people leave a position. So that's why Karl Marx said in every society there's a class. Inter cos locover est locover in Latin. It means in every society there's a class. Even in heaven there's class. So there's no space. The space is structured. That's why do you think we have social class? Why do you think we have this class? We have them because some people would not be able to move from one social ladder to another. The rich continue to get richer, the poor continue to be poorer. So there's middle class. So not all middle class, not everyone in the middle class will move to the upper class. Some in the middle class will still come back down to the lower class. Because kids in the middle class, for example, let's put it this way, kids in the middle class who do not attain quality education might not be able to move might not be able to move upper to the further to the upper class. And because they are not able to move further to the upper class, and based on demand within the economy, based on how expensive things are getting over time, they might not be able to even maintain the middle class, which might draw them down
To the
lower class.
Yeah.
Education is expensive, right? So if education is expensive, what does that simply mean? It simply means not everybody will be educated. Why do you have to pay for qualification? Because it's an economic good. In as much as we still have economic goods, we won't have equal distribution of wealth, equal distribution of education, equal distribution of resources. And because we cannot have equal distribution of all these things that are important, then not everybody will be skilled.
Okay, I get it.
You get it? So take my case as an example. It took me more than a decade after finishing university before I could obtain my master's. Why do I have to wait until now? Some of my mates that graduated with me already had their master's even the year after their graduation. See, so if they are able to have that after their graduation, and the jobs they're able to get after their graduation is with masters, it simply means they would have been earning more than what I earned from that time until now. So it's not going to there's not going to be equal distribution.
Okay.
I think, was I able to answer? Am I able to answer your
Yes.
question? Okay. So that's about the exploitation of workers. There's always going to be exploitation of workers because we have low-skilled workers more than skilled workers. So the increasing importance of transnational cooperation and FDI is a characteristic of globalization. Although many developing countries gained from FDI, some TNCs have a record of exploiting the weaker labor regulation in these countries. In these cases, workers in developing countries can suffer poor working conditions even when employed by transnational. However, although there might seem to be worker exploitation from a developed country's point of view, workers in developing countries may not feel exploited. For many, working for a TNC raises their standard of living compared to previous unemployment or working in the subsistence sector. So another reason why we have exploitation of workers is because of multinationals. They set up in a country where the wage rate is low, and they wouldn't want to even raise the wage rate. So they pay workers in developing countries that will still do the same work compared to developed countries. They pay them less. And the worst scenario is that those workers are still happy getting it because they believe working in a multinational company is better off and preferable than being unemployed or working in a domestic firm. So the wage rate in relative to domestic firms is still higher but it is not still up to what they are supposed to get. So that is what exploitation is about. Any question about exploitation?
No.
So the third problem about the second problem, or the second cause of globalization is exploitation of workers. The first one is displaced workers, which is simply linked to mostly structural unemployment. The second one is exploitation of workers. So the third one is environmental impact of increased trade. Growth will bring about resource depletion. Growth will bring about environmental damage. And that is still what globalization will bring about. So let's read anyway. Rising world production inevitably has an impact on the environment. If world production of wooden furniture rises, there must be an increase in logging of trees. If world food production rises, this must have an impact on the amount of land in cultivation and farming practices. If every Chinese and Indian household is to own a fridge, there must be an increase in the production of iron ore and electricity. So there's always going to be an opportunity cost. If we have to increase the consumption of furniture, it means we are using up trees. If you have to increase the consumption of fridge, it means we are using up iron ore and electricity. If we are supposed to increase the consumption of food, it means we are using more land for cultivation of crops. So all these things means the environment is used up. The environment is more occupied. The environment is getting damaged based on our needs and wants. Do you get the point here? So extra demand, yes. Extra demand for raw materials and increased emission and waste have so far had an overall negative impact on the world environment. For example, greenhouse gas emission continues to rise. However, environmental degradation. Do you know what environmental degradation means?
Yeah.
What's degradation?
It's when the resource depletes naturally. So how, for example, plastic, how much if you, for example, put plastic in 100 years and it doesn't deplete, that means it's non-biodegradable, for example.
Okay, yeah. So, well, when we talk about what's it called? Degradation. It simply means the natural resources are losing their quality. So it's losing that quality. I think it's clear. Yeah, your point is clear too. Anyway, it's on point. So many rich countries have made considerable progress by using some of the proceeds of economic growth to reverse environmental degradation. So, well, there is environmental damage, but most countries are now investing on environmental friendly resources or method of production. That is technology innovation. Well, that is just a way out of environmental damage. But what happens to developing countries that they are exploiting? So that's the point. I think it's clear anyway. So loss of tax revenue. For loss of tax revenue, so this is mostly for developing countries anyway. So let's read anyway. Further, firms which operate in several countries, in essence transnationals, have the ability to engage in tax avoidance. Tax avoidance, although legal, suggests a firm is deliberately manipulating the tax system to pay less than a fair amount. There are two main ways in which they do this. So there's tax avoidance. Tax avoidance is legal because you are able to find your way around paying less than what you are supposed to pay on tax. Tax evasion is illegal and it is,
harmful.
Yeah, it is criminal, and individuals might, it is a criminal offense, punishable under jail terms. So, well, how will firms, multinationals, avoid tax? Number one is based on the genuine production and transfer pricing. A firm produces good X in country A and then transports it to country B. Yeah, it uses good X to produce good Y, which it then sells. Country A has high taxes on profit and country B has low taxes on profit. So the transaction can reduce its total profit tax by putting a very low artificial price on the product made in country A before sending it to country B. Profits are then reduced in country A and increased in country B. Overall, the transactional makes a tax saving. Transfer pricing rules are often based on agreed international standards developed by the OECD. These are often, well, These are often being adopted by many countries. A high proportion of global trade is made or by buying and selling between companies which are part of the same transnational groups. The prices of these transactions have to follow international tax rules to determine how much profit is taxed in each country. However, there are in practice many transfer pricing arrangements which can be challenged. So when we talk about transfer pricing, what they do is this. Multinationals will produce in a country where the cost of production is less to put up an artificial price crossing the border to sell in a country where the taxes are low. But in those countries that the taxes are low, the prices will be higher than the cost of production. So at the end of it all, they will be paying low tax. Are you with me, or are you getting what I'm saying or not?
Yes.
We call it transfer price. They produce in a country where the cost of production is less. They put an artificial price when they are transferring the products to other countries. In the cost of transferring the products to other countries, in those countries that they are transferring the products to, the tax there are low. Do you understand? But because they are selling there, first, they've witnessed a cost reduction in the country they are. And now they're going to sell at a price higher than the cost of production here and paying a low tax there.
Okay.
So by so doing that, they are able to avoid tax. Do you get the first point there?
Yes.
We call it transfer pricing. The second way is to set up an office in a low tax country such as Ireland, Luxembourg, or Bahamas. Here, they set up their factory or facility in a country with low tax. So that is where their head office is. So because their office is there, they pay taxes from there, whatever operations they have. The taxes will be paid from that country. So they avoid tax also through that way. Then they said the revenues are then taxed in Ireland, Luxembourg, or another tax haven.
That's tax haven.
Yeah, that's tax haven. That means you are paying low tax or zero tax. So they only set up there. And whatever they have to pay, it's from that country. So that's another way to avoid tax. And the third one is to transfer production facility to a low tax country. Yeah, now you're transferring your production facility. So whatever you produce, the taxes will be charged. Not what you sell now. Whatever you produce, taxes will be charged from that country.
Okay.
So these are the ways in which you can avoid tax. Any question about them?
No.
So all these are still legal because it's normal. It is only the firm that's able to find a way around it. But they are challenging though, but most of the time governments are too busy to dig deep into operations of multinationals. And when they want to do, most multinationals, because of their financial capability, they bribe their way around it, especially in developing countries. Clear?
Yeah.
Mostly African countries, let's put it that way.
No,
there's bribery and corruption in African countries.
No, but who would set up a multinational company in Africa though?
A lot of multinational companies are in Africa.
Yeah, but
there's cheap labor, there's raw materials.
No, but when we talk about taxes,
they pay 10 to 15%. We talked about that. African countries want to attract multinationals. And one way to attract them is to assure them that they will be paying less in terms of the profit they make. Okay. The next one, increased income inequality within countries. There's always going to be the gap between the rich and the poor. In the perfect labor market where all workers are homogeneous, identical, workers will all earn the same. Globalization is shifting workers to different locations around the world. It is also shifting places of work from one country to another. 50 years ago, a low-skilled worker in a factory in the US making television sets was only competing for a job with other low-skilled workers in the local area or in the long run in the rest of the USA. Today, a low-skilled factory worker in the US is competing not only with workers who have moved into the area, but also with factory workers in China and Vietnam. So you are not just competing with workers in your area, you are competing with workers cut across the world. So if they feel that employing you will increase their cost, they move their factory or production to elsewhere. That is the point they're making. Did you get it?
Yeah.
So a transnational electronic company is likely to base its production operation in countries with low wage costs. That is what I just said now. And that's about that. So as a result, international competition has tended to substantially lower the wages of low-skilled workers in developed countries. The impact on high-skilled workers has been the reverse. In a global marketplace, their skills are high in demand because there are relatively few workers with these skills in developing countries. So the overall impact in developing countries will depend on how government respond. Like I told you earlier, it depends on the government of the day, what they want to achieve. So for developing countries, the impact of globalization on income inequality is unclear. Income inequality is rising in some developing countries but falling in others. The cause of income inequalities are complex, so it is not always easy to separate one particular cause from others. Globalization will create new industries and new type of jobs in developing countries. Demand for labor is likely to increase, particularly if globalization creates export-led growth. However, the wage differences between low-skilled and skilled labor could widen or narrow. Although transnationals relocate production to low-wage countries, they will often employ workers who are relatively skilled by that country's standards. In this case, transnational paying a high relative wage to these workers will increase income inequality. So, we can't actually state, there's no clear picture on how inequality has arisen. But we have to understand that when multinationals come into a country, they will, as soon as they come into that country, they try to employ the highest skilled workers in that country, paying them higher compared to what they would get domestically. And that means high skilled workers in domestic economy will get more pay than low skilled workers, and that would also increase the gap between the rich and the poor. Also, those high skilled workers, those that are able to get a job with multinationals, will have high income compared to the same level of skills, but they work with the domestic firms. And that will also increase the gap between the rich and the poor. It doesn't balance. Did you get it here?
Mm-hmm.
So all in all, globalization has brought about multinationals setting up in domestic countries or in developing countries. And because they are able to set up in developing countries, they pay some workers better than other workers, and that increases the gap between the rich and the poor. Clear?
Yep.
The influence of multinationals on domestic economic policy. Transnational companies are able to influence the decisions of government across the world because they have the financial capability. So this is partly because of their skills and the money to lobby governments, partly because governments are influenced by promises of large investments or threats to remove investment from their countries, and partly because transnationals have a record of using bribery to influence government decisions. I think we talked about that and it's clear. Any question about that?
Yeah.
So non-economic impact of globalization. Globalization is not just an economic phenomenon. It is a political, social, technological, and cultural phenomenon too. One area where it has a non-economic impact is culture. Globalization weakens native cultures. US culture in particular are seen through US films and television programs shown throughout the world. It's replacing some aspects of native culture. Politics too is affected by globalization. Nation states have lost sovereignty, which is the ability to make choices about how their affairs are conducted. Before I go further, globalization has allowed cultural transition. So people with globalization, people outside of Libya understand what happens in Libya. They understand Libyan culture. Libyans can see other culture and start behaving as one. So globalization has changed our identity, our perspective regarding our heritage, because we can see the world becomes a small marketplace. So we can see what happens globally. So that changes and that also changes our sovereignty, because with globalization, Libya is complaining about influx of immigrants. It's globalization. Globalization has brought about it, and borders are not what we can as well, have power over anymore. Before you know it, the borders are opened, and they are opened up because of international trade. Yes, you still have to request for a visa to enter, yes. But whatever the case might be, globalization has taken part of our sovereignty. And when we talk about sovereignty, we're talking about the power we have as a nation has taken it away. So nation states have lost, okay, that is said. And okay, so that's about that. And they said partly this is because they have signed international treaties which limit their sovereignty, and partly it is because the forces of globalization have become so strong that states cannot resist them. Globalization has made everybody to sign treaties, which simply means understand an MOU, which means we all have to, rely on each other. So there's interdependence. And if you are putting yourself out of it, there will be retaliation because you cannot only survive anymore. You need other countries to survive. So that has reduced the power we have as a state. Do you get it? There's FIFA, Federation of International Football Association. There's CAF. Why do we have all these associations? We are having them to put us together in the same spotlight.
Yeah.
So if you want to play football and to be known and to enjoy playing and to make money, you have to be part of FIFA. So your country has to participate in FIFA organized
Events.
competition. So which simply means you cannot be a country and play football alone without involving FIFA. So that is what they're saying here. So we are losing our sovereignty partially because of globalization. Any question about that?
No.
So the overall impact of globalization. Countries can both benefit and lose out from the process of globalization. They benefit economically if globalization leads to rising incomes, more and better quality jobs, lower prices, and more consumer choices. They lose out if globalization leads to a loss of industries, higher unemployment, and lower wages. So there's a gain if it brings about income inequality, if it brings about lower prices, if it brings about more choices for consumers and better living standards. But it's a lose gain if globalization has brought about unemployment, it has brought about structural unemployment, it has brought about low wages. Because how can it bring about these things? It can bring about these things because with globalization, firms can start thinking about changing their location to a location that is low cost, which means those that are there would lose their jobs. With globalization, the supply of workers are increasing, which means I can be educated in Nigeria, work in Libya, increase the supply of labor in Libya. And as soon as the supply of labor increases, wages become low. If this is the situation, it's a lose. Any question about that?
No.
All right. So they said, the next paragraph said, in countries like China, the benefit from rapid growth in incomes caused by globalization have to be offset against the very large negative impact that the growth of high polluting industries has had on the environment. Equally, there has been a massive internal migration of people from rural areas to cities, which brings its own benefits, but also has costs in terms of loss of family ties. Citing example using China, yes, production has increased in China, but what about pollution? That's the cost of globalization. That's the cost of growth anyway. Also, they said people move from rural areas to cities. What happens there? Family ties, cut in family ties. People are losing their family ties because they have to move because of geographical mobility of labor. Economists disagree about the exact cost and benefit of globalization. For example, what are the benefits in terms of increased income? What are the environmental costs? And do the benefits of increasing income weigh these environmental costs? So there's always going to be cost-benefit analysis done. So equally, there's no agreement about the extent to which it is globalization that is bringing about these costs and benefits. For example, if the Indian economy grew by 5% last year, what proportion of this was due to globalization? And what proportion of the environmental degradation in Brazil is being caused by globalization? So arguments for and against globalization tends to be linked to a number of other economic debates discussed elsewhere. So, well, globalization has its cost, has its benefits, but the extent to which globalization has bring about benefits or cost cannot be justified because there are other factors that are linked to globalization. So they said, does economic growth, now look at the questions. They said, does economic growth lead to an increase in economic welfare? Is the question. Well, does economic growth lead to an increase in economic welfare? Yes, to some extent. Is economic growth unsustainable from an environmental perspective? It is not. Because with economic growth, there's always going to be environmental damage. Though, yes, some countries might be able to use the income revenue made from growth to replace, to start production that are environmentally friendly. But what about the damage in the past? Can they cover up for the damage in the past? No. Does protectionism rather than free trade promote economic growth? Protectionism simply means you are closing your border, you are restricting trade. And when you restrict trade, you are closing your economy. And when you close your economy cannot grow. Yes, you might be able to produce, there could be subsistence production, but you need other countries for those things that you cannot produce. So economic growth might be difficult when there's protectionism. Are you with me, please? Do transnational companies have more power over economies than most nation states? And do they act purely to gain profit for their shareholders? Well, transnational companies have more powers when it comes to developing or less developed countries because they have the financial capability to bribe their way around things. But to developed countries, that might be difficult because developed countries, there's accountability. To what extent are developing countries lifting themselves out of poverty? Is there any evidence to suggest that developing countries are catching up with developed countries? Well, developing countries now rely mostly on transnational companies, and it's about export-led growth. And with export-led growth, things can get better. But when we talk about emerging economies like China, India, they start competing with developed countries in the service sector. Is the rich developed world exploiting the poor developing world? Is a question for us to answer. Are they exploiting?
Saying they're exploiting is pretty subjective.
Why do you say it's pretty subjective? Why?
Because it could be the way. I mean, what would you define by them exploiting them? Like underpaying them?
Yes, underpaying them, using up their resources, and as soon as they are done, they leave the country. They are there because taxes are favorable.
Usually, yes. Usually, yes.
They said our organizations such as World Trade Organization and International Monetary Fund, which support or promote trade liberalization, controlled by the rich countries of the world, and do they act against the interests of poor countries? Mostly, yes. You know why? Because WTO, the majority are, some countries are not even part of the World Trade Organizations, and they do export and imports. So the WTO would listen mostly to, they are controlled by rich countries. So because they are controlled by rich countries, they serve the interests of rich countries mostly. Do you understand? So that ends chapter 22, right? The effects of globalization. So you have the example practice. Can you do it now, please?
Let me get my notebook.